Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am covering the terrible disaster at Friars Goose Chemical Works in Gateshead, which took place in 1891 with the loss of 7 lives. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money at all, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. At around 7 p.m. on the night of July the 26th, 1891, at the Friars Goose Chemical Works in Gateshead, a fire had broken out in one of the condensers used on the premises. 2 men had gone up to the condensers, which were around 90 feet high, which was also where the water tank was, with the intention of turning on the water to put out the fire. And another workman at the works had immediately gone to get a hose to attend to the fire. But before he was able to return, the condenser that was on fire fell to the ground, taking with it a man by the name of William Heslop, who had been one of the men who had climbed up to them. And he was trapped in the rubble below. And the other man who had gone up, Joseph Knott, had been standing on another platform, and he luckily escaped unhurt. Several workers were quickly on the scene and attempted to pull William from the rubble, when tragically 3 more of the adjoining condensers fell to the ground, burying them all. 6 of the men were said to have died instantly, but the 7th, a man by the name of James McCuskin, was still alive, but trapped between some flagstones by his legs. A rescue party of men began to attempt to release James. However, it was a very dangerous job, as the remaining 2 condensers were thought to be in danger of falling, as they were no longer supported because of the earlier collapse, and the whole area was a huge pile of masonry, and the air was filled with the stench of fumes of the acid used at the chemical works. But the men were determined to get their work made out. James, who was awake, was able to talk to his rescuers, and at one point they were able to get close enough to him to give him tea and brandy, and were even able to get an air pump to him to help with his breathing because of the fumes, and the men worked tirelessly throughout the night. In the early hours of the morning, it was suggested that a rope could be placed under the arms of the trapped man, and the other men could try and pull him out, but James said that his legs were trapped and that they would not be able to pull him out until they were freed, and when they did try, he simply screamed out in pain, and they abandoned the idea. A priest had been sent for by the name of Father Rafferty, and he stayed with James throughout most of the night. However, he was only able to speak to him from a safe distance, and when he was no longer able to stand, Father Fitzgerald took his place, and he was able to step further into the rubble, and he was actually able to speak to James through a small hole where he could be seen. Eventually they were able to free one of James's legs, and it was then suggested by one of the doctors that they may be able to amputate his other foot, and that this would free him from the rubble. However, it was not to be, as James was growing weaker by the hour, and before anything further could be done, he died from exhaustion and suffocation from the fumes. And at the time of his death, he had been trapped in the rubble for around 15 hours. Friends and family had gathered outside of the chemical works, and most had been there all night and had refused to leave. But after the death of James McCuskin, the rescue mission was halted. It was known that no other men had survived, and due to the dangerous nature of the work involved to find their bodies, the work was postponed until the remaining condensers had been removed, making it safer for the men to work in the area without the risk of further loss of life, and the huge crowds of people eventually had to return to their homes. The fire continued to burn in the shaft where the condenser had once stood, and the fire brigade struggled to get it under control as it had been tightly packed with coke at the bottom, which kept the fire burning for quite some time. The men who had been killed in the accident were William Parkinson, who was 25 years old and single, George Robertson, who was 47-year-old and married with 2 children, William Heslop, who was 40 years old and married with 5 children, James McCuskey, who was 50 years old and married with 7 children, James McTiernan, who was 52 years old and married with 3 children, Henry Shorey, who was 45 years old and married but did not have any children, and Robert Johnson, who was 50 years old and married with 4 children. And there were 2 other men by the names of James Doherty and Edward Lewis, who had been injured, but they had not been injured seriously. The chemical factory, which had employed around 500 men, had to be closed down, and all of the men were unable to work, which of course left many families in the area without their usual weekly wage, and the damage to the works was estimated at around £10,000. The remaining 2 condensers were blown up by dynamite to make the area safer, and it was thought that the work to recover the bodies of the 7 men would be able to start again within a couple of days. And by July the 28th, the fire was still burning, and it was thought that the bodies may not be reached in time to identify them. However, by the 29th, the body of Henry Shorey was discovered. He was still identifiable, which was lucky as he had been in where the fire had been burning, and the searchers believed that his death had been almost instantaneous. A further 4 bodies were found a short time later, leaving just 2 remaining in the rubble, and one of those was James McCuskey, whose body was still trapped, and the other one being William Heslop, who had been the first man lost to the accident. The inquest was opened at the chemical works before Coroner Graham, and the jury viewed the bodies that had been found so far, including that of James McCuskey, who was at this time still trapped in the rubble. All were formally identified, although no details were given as to who had identified each man, and the inquest was then adjourned for 1 month until August 26, 1891. The remains of William Heslop were found on August the 1st. Sadly, due to the high temperature of the fire, only a few fragments of bone were found, and a watch and a belt buckle, which were the only identifiable objects to prove that these were the remains of William Heslop. And an inquest was briefly opened on William's remains, and this too was then adjourned until the August one. The funerals of several of the men took place in early August. James McCuskey was buried at Jesmond Cemetery, with the procession leaving his home in Pilgrim Street. And it was said that Pilgrim Street, which is in Newcastle, in case anybody didn't realise, was lined with hundreds of people, and they all followed the hearse to the cemetery. And the newspaper reported that all 7 of James's children were present at the funeral. The funeral of William Parkinson took place at Hewitt Cemetery, and it was said that the procession to the churchyard included between 500 and 600 workmen from not just the chemical works, but other works in the area. And also at the funeral were his father, 4 sisters, 2 brothers, and a lot of other family members and many of his friends. The funerals of William Heslop, George Robertson and Robert Johnson also took place at Hewitt Cemetery, and although these 3 funerals were not covered in quite as much detail, it was said that again hundreds lined the roads and followed the men to their final resting places, with an estimated 1,000 people in attendance. Robert Johnson was buried in what was described at the time as the older section of the cemetery. William Heslop and George Robertson were said to be buried in what was then known as the newer part of the cemetery, and on screen at the moment is the headstone for William Heslop, which I actually photographed around 2 years ago at Hewitt Cemetery, and at the time I was not fully aware of the story, and I must admit that looking back now, it is tragic to think that poor William's family would have had very little to actually bury. Sadly, I did not find any details of the funerals of either James McTiernan or Henry Shorey, or any locations of their burials. The adjourned inquest was held at Gateshead Town Hall, again before Coroner Graham, and one of the first things discussed was the fund that had been set up to aid the families of the men who had lost their lives in the disaster, and it was said at the time the total was around £846. The inquest was somewhat different to those that I normally cover, as a lot of the information was technical details, and I've decided not to really cover them as they are quite confusing, and I do like to try and actually understand what I am writing about, so I will only cover the more simple basic information. Now, we did not find any details of any post-mortems. However, Dr. Thompson stated that he had been present at the chemical works on the night of the accident and had attended as best as possible to James McCuskey, and he stated that his death had been caused by exhaustion and the fumes from the acid and other chemicals used at the works. And it's no doubt likely that the post-mortem would have stated that the other men had died due to being suffocated and unfortunately because of the fire. Mr. France has said he was the manager of the chemical works. He said that the condensers were kept in good condition and were kept in careful repair, with 2 men employed to do nothing other than examine them for damage on a constant basis, checking for things such as loose bolts. And he added that the 2 remaining condensers had shown to be stable and safe despite concerns after the accident, as it had taken a considerable amount of dynamite to blow them down. And David Gray of Gateshead said he was employed to make sure a certain amount of water was kept in each condenser, and he said at the end of his shift on the day of the accident all had been fine. He added that he had 32 years of experience working with condensers. James Finnegan, also of Gateshead, said he was one of the men employed to keep the condensers in good repair. He stated he had seen to them the day before the accident and had seen nothing wrong with any of them. Thomas Megan and John McEwen, both of Gateshead, spoke of having seen a small flame burning in the area of the condensers, which had been reported. James Hughes of Felon also spoke of the same flame, classed as a leakage. He said that the bricklayers came and put this right, and he did not see the flame again. Thomas Newton and William Turnbull all spoke of the repairs being carried out and no sign of any flame after this, or issues with the furnace or condensers. Richard Hollingworth of Gateshead said he had been near the furnace on the morning of the accident. He said the bricklayers had been working on a leakage repair, and he said that the hole where the leakage was very small. Thomas Wilkinson said he was an engineer at the chemical works. He had been told of the leakage at the furnace and had examined it. He thought it to be small and simple to repair. When asked, he said had the damage been found earlier in the week, the work would have continued as normal at the chemical factory and the equipment would have been examined on a daily basis until repairs were carried out at the weekend, as it was not seen as something of great importance. James McConnell, I can never say his name, James McConnell, said he was the foreman bricklayer at the chemical works, where he also lived. He said he had been called to the furnace the day before the accident. He had seen the small flame, but did not think it to be important. The following day, when he examined the furnace, it was a little worse, and repair work had then begun. He had returned to the area at around 6:30 p.m. He then found that the coke in the condenser was on fire. He went for assistance and was joined by Joseph Knott, and on climbing up to the condensers, they found William Heslop was already there, and that he had turned the water on to the condenser. He had then climbed down, leaving the other 2 men on top, and on turning to look back, he said he saw that the fire had spread, and he went to find a hosepipe. However, he said before he could return, the first condenser fell. He said luckily Joseph was on another of the condensers and was able to reach the ground safely with his help, and he said he did not see any sign of William Heslop after the condenser had fallen. Joseph Knott said he worked at the chemical works in Gateshead and had gone up to the condenser with Mr. McConnell. William Heslop was already on the top. He said Mr. McConnell left them there and he asked William what was wrong, and he told him the condenser was on fire. He said that he would then look around and check that the others were okay, and he had just stepped on to the adjoining condenser when he heard a strange noise, and as he turned he saw the first condenser fall, taking William Heslop to the ground with it. Mr. Stewart said he was the district manager for the alkali company, and as soon as he heard of the disaster at the chemical works he had gone straight to help in any way that he could. When asked his opinion on the cause of the accident, he said he felt that the original crack or hole in the furnace had not been serious enough when it had first been found to cause any concern, but it would seem that it had got worse over the weekend and caused the flame to basically be sucked into the condenser and set the coke alight. The coroner spoke to the jury, saying that it was his opinion that this was a tragic accident and that the staff and management of the chemical works were not to blame. And the jury, after retiring for 45 minutes, returned the verdict that a crack in the furnace had been the cause of the accident. Hot air had been drawn into the centre of the condenser through the flue from the furnace, and that this had ignited the coke, and this had caused the condenser to become damaged and fall, and in doing so it had weakened the three closest to it, causing them to fall a short time later, and it was their opinion that the whole disaster was purely accidental, and the deaths of those involved was also accidental, and they then ended by saying that the management of the chemical works were cleared of all blame for the deaths of the 7 men involved in the disaster. A meeting was held at Gateshead Town Hall in September of that year to discuss the disaster fund and how best to distribute it to the widows and families of those who had died in the disaster, and it was thought that the fund would total around £1,300, which in today's money would be around £207,000, and it was decided that the money would be invested, which would give a return of £153 per year, which gave them £2.19 per week to use for the families. This was then to be given in order of the amount of children left behind, which for example would mean that one family would receive 13 shillings per week, and that the widow who did not have any children would receive 5 shillings per week, and the money was expected to last for around 10 years. There are no further details on this, but I do have to wonder just how long the money would have lasted in reality, as it may have run out a lot sooner than the expected 10 years, as each passing year would have no doubt seen the families needing higher sums to live on. The chemical works itself finally closed down in around 1914, so it does show that repair work was carried out after the 1891 disaster and that the works did reopen. However, I did not find any details of how long this took or how long the men who had been employed there were out of work for. This was an incredibly tragic story, one where I can't help but wonder if the outcome could have been different, if the furnace had been repaired sooner, or perhaps if it had been taken out of action until the damage was repaired. However, it does seem that small cracks or holes were quite common and not seen as being dangerous. But sadly, in this case, it seems the damage in the furnace got worse much quicker than expected, and in the end, this was the cause of the fire in the condenser, thus resulting in the spread of the fire, which caused the condenser to fall. And the brave men who risked their lives to save William Heslop after this ended up losing their own lives when the other 3 condensers followed the first one to the ground, burying them under the rubble, which was also burning in some parts from the coke in the condenser. In the end, the only verdict the jury could come to was one of a tragic accident, and that not only caused the loss of the lives of 7 of the victims, but also caused the loss of 500 jobs until the chemical works could be repaired and reopened. But what do you think? Do you think this was an accident that could have been avoided? Do you think it was correct that no blame fell on the company, even though it does seem that the repairs to the furnace were delayed? Or do you think that the verdict of an accident was the correct one? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And I just want to add here before I do go that unfortunately the location is very difficult to get to. Where the chemical works once stood is not really something that you can get access to anymore. So a lot of the photos that I have used are basically just in the general area. In fact, in reality, there really was only one photo that I could actually get. So obviously, like I say, they are just in the general area and they're not actually the exact location of where the chemical works once stood. Anyway, I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.